Hey there! So, whether you've been a long-time subscriber or you literally just discovered my channel yesterday, no doubt you've noticed that in between all the Doctor Who videos, there's this recurring series of animations, dating back to my very first upload in 2013. Maddox and Friends. I sense your curiosity is piqued by this. Either that or you just don't care because you're only here for the Doctor Who stuff. That's valid. But still, after all this time, I've never really properly delved into my creative vision for my cartoon series. I kind of just did all this crazy stuff and put it out there and never really annotated it. And I concede that, in retrospect, a lot of the events or creative decisions which happen in them are a bit bizarre and not very well elaborated on. Well, fear not, because I think it's time for me to finally sit down in front of a camera and explain to you what Maddox and Friends is and how it came to be. So, I've always been pretty artistic for as long as I can remember, and coincidentally, I've also been rather enamoured by cartoons for as long as I can remember. Growing up, I watched a lot of Disney movies, Looney Tunes, episodes of The Simpsons, and so on. And on top of that, I've always had a bit of an escapist head in the clouds mentality to combat the mundanity of everyday life. So naturally, when you put all three of these together, you get a young boy who wanted to invent a crazy, wacky cartoon version of himself going on wild adventures. Thing is, I was pretty technologically limited when I was a child. I didn't have my own computer, internet access was limited, and the shared family computer was... what? Windows XP? Yeah, my best efforts with those resources were like paint doodles at best, so I didn't even bother thinking about making full-on animated projects back then. No way. I focused on creating hand-drawn comics instead, and it just so happens that I still have a bunch of them right here. I have quite a love-hate relationship with these comics. Like, they do play an important role in my creative process, and quite a lot of elements in them do eventually end up in the cartoons themselves. But at the same time, a lot of them are so unbelievably cringy. It's not even particularly the art style, it's the subject matter itself. I was making these while I was in secondary school, so between the ages of 11 and 14. So a lot of these just have really painfully lame teenage humour. Some of it involves my younger self exploring his sexual identity and social struggles, and bits of it are a tad insensitive because some of my friends would often suggest crass things for me to include, and I just go along with them. So yeah, I'm gonna withhold a lot of this from public view, but they were my training wheels. My life structure back then would have comprised of weekdays at school, so hanging around and goofing about with friends and such, and then every other weekend Adam and Holly would come over to visit, who are my dad's, well, if you want to be technical, stepdad's children from another marriage, which effectively makes them my siblings, and you know, being kids back then, we were all obviously very hyperactive and every visit was like an exciting adventure. So I would naturally incorporate those two most exciting events of my life into these comics, sibling visits and my friend group. Sometimes I would just focus on one of these elements, like I think at one point Adam and Holly just flat out weren't in them at all. But yeah, overall you can kind of see where this three Maddox children and their friends structure in the cartoons originally came from. Now, I think I need to briefly explain my cartoon self's original design. So, I wasn't exactly a handsome child, and I was pretty self-aware of that. Other kids would often straight up call me goofy because of my teeth, and I was never really a fan of the short buzz cuts that my mum would force on me, which is kind of ironic considering... yeah. But still, I never really felt strongly offended by this. Like, I kind of took some weird twisted pride in it instead, like, hell yeah, I am ugly and I own it. But yeah, that's why my original cartoon form looks like this. It was me channeling my self-awareness of my own unappealing form into art. I did eventually end up dropping this design though, because all the other characters in the comics would just look normal, and the inconsistency of that bugged me, so I eventually ended up renovating my character's design to look more in line with everyone else's. And that's ultimately why I don't look like that in the actual cartoons. Although, could you imagine? Now, when I turned 14, my mum died. Awkward tonal whiplash, I know. But yeah, naturally, I reacted kind of badly to that, and that's when me really yearning for a more escapist life really reached a boiling point, and drawing comics just simply wasn't doing it for me anymore. But yes, I closed off this continuity, so yes, these are not canon to the cartoons, but more on that later. And by this point, I also finally had my own laptop, which I think was Windows 7? But either way, I felt more technologically competent to make actual animations now. I had previously made a couple of attempts which just didn't feel right, but by the time I was 15 I was determined to actually finally make a cartoon series. So how did that go? Well, when I said I felt more technologically competent, looking back, my methods were still laughably primitive. So by this point I knew that you could draw shapes in Microsoft PowerPoint, and anybody who's ever had to do a class presentation knows how the slideshow function works. Basically, my creative process back then was creating the characters and the backgrounds out of shapes and drawing tools in Microsoft PowerPoint, getting them in the positions I wanted, taking a screenshot in full screen mode, saving that screenshot, and then moving the positions of the assets slightly for the next screenshot, rinse and repeat. Oh, and then I'd sync up the screenshots to a soundtrack in Windows Movie Maker. Yep. And I showed absolutely no professionalism in this process at all. Like, the cartoons are all in 4:3. I never tampered with the export settings, so they all have these huge, ugly black borders around them, and you only need to check out the original uploads to see those. Yeah, there's a reason why I proceeded to re-upload them all in 2018, because it was really starting to irritate me in retrospect. But I'm too sentimental to get rid of the original uploads, so that's why those are still up. The audio recording method wasn't much better. I mean, I thankfully knew what Audacity was, and I was using that to edit, but the voice recordings themselves were all being done on the Voice Memos app on my iPod. I was composing my own music digitally thanks to my experience with Music GCSE, but a lot of those tracks were included as MIDIs, which were, again, recorded through the Memos app on my iPod. So that explains why a lot of the music in the old cartoons is really poor quality. Although I was at least smart enough to get a clean digital export of the main theme music, so there's that. But yeah, speaking of recordings, at least the main cast didn't disappoint. I mean, obviously I was there, but a lot of my secondary school friends were really eager to portray themselves as well, as was Holly. And Adam sometimes required a bit of coercing depending on the installment. His enthusiasm just went up and down sometimes. But overall, I think it turned out well. This was how we rolled for 3 years straight. From April 2013 to April 2015. Time to get more specific.